Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Theosophical Society for inviting me here to speak and for publishing my books. And thank you to Nancy Grace for making the arrangements to get me here. So Memories and Visions of Paradise was my first book. The original edition was published in 1989. And the Quest Revised Edition, which is much superior, was published in 1995. The germ of the idea came to me in the early 1980s. I was already interested in the commonality of at the heart of world religions, and it seemed to me that mythology might hold a key to understanding that better. So I spent some delightful years researching in the Princeton University Library. I was living in Princeton at that time. And then later at the New York Public Library and Library of Congress. Of course, those were the pre-internet days when research was a little more of a hands-on activity. And in some ways I kind of miss that. These days, most of my research is done by way of Google, and it takes some of the fun out of it, I have to say. So mythology, what is mythology? Every human society has stories about how things came to be the way they are. And there have been, for a very long time, different ways of thinking about myths. Theagenes of Rhegium, and we have to distinguish him because among the ancient Greeks there were several philosophers named Theagenes, who lived in the 6th century BC, believed that the old myths of the gods and Mount Olympus and so on were allegories. They were imperfect memories of people and events that actually had existed and occurred. But a couple of centuries later, another Greek named Theagenes advanced the idea that myths were allegories, that they didn't represent actual people, places, things, or event, but were stories meant to carry sacred meanings, wisdom, so on. Euhemerus, on the other hand, in 4th century BC, had the notion that they were garbled memory. Anyway, a third, much more modern interpretation of myth comes by way of philologist Max Mueller, who in the late 19th century suggested that myths are a disease of language. That's a very peculiar idea on the face of it. And when I first heard that, I immediately rejected it because I had, as I was researching all of these myths, I had a very affectionate attitude toward them. And the idea that they could be some kind of disease just didn't sit well with me. But I'm going to return to that idea later and see if there might be some usefulness in it. But what struck me in world mythology was that there are strong commonalities. Of course, stories of creation are to be found in every mythology, because after all, myths mostly have to do with how things got to be the way they are. So they have to start somewhere with the beginning of the world. But then most cultures seem to have some story of a golden age or a paradise at the beginning of the world. And I'm certainly not the first person to have noticed this. Every student of world mythology finds this early on. But I want to start just by reading some of the gems I found in my reading back in those early days. Here's the Roman historian Tacitus writing in the 1st century. The most ancient human beings lived with no evil desires, without guilt or crime, and therefore without penalties or compulsions. Nor was there any need of rewards, since by the prompting of their own nature, they followed righteous ways. Since nothing contrary to morals was desired, nothing was forbidden through fear. Here's the Mahabharata of India. In the first age, there was but one religion, and all men were saintly. Therefore, they were not required to perform religious ceremonies. There were no gods in the first age, and there were no demons. The first age was without disease. There was no lessening with the years. There was no hatred or vanity or evil thought whatsoever. No sorrow, no fear. In those times, men lived as long as they chose to live and were without any fear of death. And then the Taoist sage Chuang-Tzu in the 4th century BC writes, "In the age of perfect virtue, they were upright and correct, without knowing that to be so was righteousness. They loved one another, without knowing that to do so was benevolence. They were honest and leal-hearted, without knowing that it was good faith. In their simple movements, they employed the services of one another, without thinking that they were conferring or receiving any gift. Therefore, their actions left no trace, and there was no record of their affairs." So I could go on with similar examples, but you get the idea. Now, there are common themes in these paradise myths, one of which is the magical landscape. Very often in stories of the original paradise or golden age, there is a world tree in the middle of the world, whether it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil or Yggdrasil in Norse mythology. Very often there's a mountain in the middle of the world. Maybe the axis mundi, or the great tree, grows out of the mountain. Example, of course, is Olympus. Very often there are 4 rivers that flow away in the 4 directions from the world mountain. Many mythologies, including the Greek, the Hindu, Persian, Mayan, and Lakota, speak of world ages. The Hindu mythology, for example, speaks of the first age, the perfect age, as the Krita Yuga, followed by the Treta Yuga, the Dwapara Yuga, and now the current age, of course, is the Kali Yuga, which is the worst of the 4 ages. And of course, the Greeks started with the Golden Age, but then the Age of Silver, and so on. And this is a common theme of the world ages. The first was the best, and now we're living in the worst. So it's the very opposite of the idea of universal progress, which we'll come back to maybe a little bit more today. And when I speak tomorrow, I'm going to talk in much more detail about the religion of progress. Speaking of world ages, the Lakota say that the world is protected by a great metaphoric buffalo who stands at the western gate of the universe and holds back the waters that periodically inundate the earth. Every year, the buffalo loses a hair on one of its legs. At the end of every age, it loses a leg, and the world is flooded and renewed. And so the Lakota say, today the world is on its last leg. That's the origin of that saying. Also, a theme in these myths is that this was a time, the first age, the age of paradise, was an age of miracles and wonders. There was a single language that all human beings could speak and understand, and this language was also shared by the animals. So people and birds and mammals, other mammals, all understood one another perfectly. All people were wise, beautiful, they were immortal, they were able to fly, had other miraculous powers. They were saintly of character, as you could tell in some of the examples I read earlier. There was a universal communion with deity. The creator lived among humanity, or the divine parents. And there was also in many of the myths a sense that the afterworldly paradise to which human beings go after they die, maybe if they've been good or just maybe anyway, depending on the culture. That afterworldly paradise was not divided from or separate from the ordinary earthly experience of people in the Golden Age. Sometimes it's said there was a rainbow bridge connecting this world with the next world and uniting them. Then, of course, all of these traditions speak of a change that occurred at some point. Either the end of that first perfect world age or a fall, as it's spoken of in the biblical tradition. Let's see, here's an example from the Hopi. People began to divide and draw away from one another, those of different races and languages than those who remembered the plan of creation and those who did not. There came among them a handsome one in the form of a snake with a big head. He led the people still further away from one another and their pristine wisdom. They became suspicious of one another and accused one another wrongfully until they became fierce and warlike and began to fight one another. Here's going back to the Mahabharata. In the Treta Yuga, the Second Age, sacrifices began and virtue lessened a quarter. Humankind sought truth and performed religious ceremonies. They obtained what they desired by giving and doing. In the Dwapara Yuga, religion lessened one half. Mind lessened, truth declined, and there came desire and disease and calamities. Because of these, men had to undergo penances. It was a decadent age by reason of the prevalence of sin. In the Kali, or the present Yuga, only 1/4 of virtue remaineth. The world is afflicted, men turn to wickedness, disease cometh, all creatures degenerate. Contrary effects are obtained by performing holy rites. Change passeth over all things. So some of the themes here include disobedience of some original divine commandments. This idea of the knowledge of good and evil, of course, we find in the biblical tradition, but there are some parallels elsewhere as well. Going back to the Taoists and Chuang-Tzu, he says, the knowledge of the ancients was perfect. In what way was it perfect? They were not yet aware that there were things. This is the most perfect knowledge. Nothing can be added. Then some were aware that there were things, but not aware that there were distinctions among them. Then some were aware that there were distinctions, but not yet aware that there was right and wrong among them. When right and wrong became manifest, the Tao thereby declined. So this sense of judgment, of rationality, of distinctions is correlated with the fall, both in the Hebraic story of the forbidden truth of the forbidden fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and also the Taoist tradition. The sense of forgetting of something that we originally knew, the loss of miraculous powers, the sense of banishment from our original home, and then the appearance of a great flood or other catastrophes. This is another theme that we find almost everywhere. This set of stories and the parallels between them, again, is something that every mythologist confronts early on. And so different notions have arisen as to, what all of this means, most of them tracing back either to the ideas of Theagenes, that it's all an allegory, or of Euhemerus, that this is somehow a garbled memory. Again, I'll return to that in a moment, but this being so prevalent, so universal, this is an idea that one can't escape, in a sense. It's part of us as human beings, no matter what culture we come from. There's some residue of this idea that haunts us individually and as societies. So with a sense of being cut off, there's also the longing somehow to return to this original state of beatitude, connectedness, and so on. And so in almost every tradition, there is a sense that there will be a return at some point to this perfect state. Whether it's the sense, the belief that the current world age will at some point end and a new Krita Yuga will occur, or just that the current corrupt world will be swept away and be replaced by a perfected or renewed paradise. So we have in Christianity the whole idea of revelation, the revelation of St. John, the tribulations that will occur to cleanse the world so that Christ can return. The Hopi speak of the great purification. And I came across this interesting little gem. The Hopi say that their prophets long ago told of the coming of wheeled boxes rolling over black snakes stretched across the land. They also spoke of special cobwebs by means of which people would be able to communicate over great distances. Hopi prophets say that within the next few decades, humankind will either destroy itself or enter into a new spiritual age, the fifth world. They foresee wars, famines, and natural disasters as steps in this great purification. And so eschatology, the sense of the end of the world, preparing the way for renewal, is present, for example, in the ghost dance, that the prophecy that swept Native American communities during the latter part of the 19th century, and many, many other examples. But just with this one example, we see a people who have been and are being decimated by foreign invaders, and they see their world, in fact, degenerating and coming to an end. So it's easy to understand how this kind of eschatology would appeal viscerally to people in that kind of situation. But the Native Americans at the end of the 19th century were by far not the only human culture or community to experience great challenges and privations and so on. And wherever we look, wherever people have confronted existential difficulties, we see this eschatological fervor returning. Paradise has also been a force in human culture, in literature, going back to Dante's Divine Comedy, which of course is written in 3 parts, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, the return to paradise. I found a wonderful short story by Dostoevsky called The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, in which the protagonist has a dream in which people return to this perfect, innocent condition. The story of Oz, made into the famous Hollywood movie in 1939, starring Judy Garland. Remember, in real life, everything's in black and white. But then the tornado comes, she's swept up into another reality, and suddenly it's Technicolor. Of course, there are problems to confront in Oz as well, but it's in color. Or Never Never Land in Peter Pan, and so on, all the way up through plenty of examples in science fiction. The planet Krypton in Superman. It's a place where people have miraculous powers, but it's a world that's coming to an end, and so Superman, as an infant, is sent out into the universe to find a place where paradise can be somehow reborn. There was a novel enormously popular back in the 1930s called Lost Horizon by James Hilton, which was made into another Hollywood film, where explorers find this lost kingdom of Shangri-La somewhere in the Himalayas, and people live forever or practically forever and are wise and happy. And the main explorer's brother doesn't feel at home there, so he has to leave. And of course, the film ends with the protagonist, finding his way back to Shangri-La, back to paradise. The dream of an earthly paradise has been a motivation for all kinds of explorers, going back to Christopher Columbus and reading the journals of Columbus. It's clear that this was a religious expedition. It wasn't just about finding a better trade route to India and making a lot of money. Columbus and the people who sent him and many of the explorers who came after him were looking for a new world. There was a sense that Europe was decadent and declining and overfull of people and disease, and that there was some place in the world that was still pure. And so when America was discovered by the Europeans, there was this sense among Europeans and European philosophers, including people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that this was the place where humanity could make a new stand. America was the new paradise. I came across a book published in 1842 by J.A. Eltizer called "The Paradise Within Reach of All Men by Power of Nature and Machinery." I love that title. But the mid-1800s were a time of utopian thinking all across America. Utopian communities were being established. For example, New Harmony, established by Robert Owen, the Shakers. And this has been a theme that's recurred in America again and again with the hippies and the Back to the Land movement, in which I was a enthusiastic participant back in the 1970s. Joni Mitchell's famous song, which was the anthem of that generation, telling us or admonishing us to get back to the garden. this universal sense of there being something precious in our background from which we've been cut off, that we've been divided from one another. This is profound. Even the word religion reflects this. Of course, it's from the Latin religare, meaning to bind back. Well, bind back to what? You know, it's not just to an otherworldly deity. It's also to some true self that we have lost. Is this just an allegory of childhood? Well, that's one of the interpretations that philosophers have offered for the paradise myth, that, you know, we human beings started out in a state of innocence like an infant, and as we grow up, we become more intelligent, wiser, gain responsibilities, and, you know, it's just the way it is. We look back with some longing, but at the same time, you know, you can't really go back to becoming an infant. You have to go through the whole round of life. Among neuroscientists, there are some clues that I think are really interesting, that may give us some insights into where this myth ultimately comes from. Wonderful book by a neuroscientist named Jill Bolte Taylor, B-O-L-T-E. Maybe some of you are familiar with the book. A neuroscientist, again, who a number of years ago had a stroke. And being a neuroscientist, she was able to observe the process very closely. And what happened was that as part of her brain, as it happened, the left half of her brain was being devastated by this stroke. What she actually subjectively experienced was a state of beatitude. She lost her linguistic ability. She was just able to crawl to a telephone and summon help. But over the course of the next hours and days, she completely lost her linguistic ability, but entered into this state of undifferentiated bliss. And over the course of a number of years, she was able to regain her linguistic ability and in the process analyze and record and transmit, you know, what had happened to her. But this is similar, after all, to what's reported by so many people who have near-death experiences. People who come very close to, you know, physical death, but are revived and then report having, you know, floated above the body, and suddenly all pain is gone, and not only physical pain but psychic pain, and they're fine, and they see, you know, people around them all worried, and maybe doctors frantically resuscitating them, and they're going, "What's the problem?" Is this the prototypical mystical experience, or a clue as to what the mystical experience is really all about? Do we actually have this potential within us that humankind has sought to reawaken for age after age through meditation, ritual, music, dance, art, yoga, Tai Chi, you know, the list goes on and on and on. A part of ourselves that's different from our rational linguistic self, that keeps us aware of and in tune with not only our own psychic and physical self, but also the rest of nature, the rest of the universe. That said, this longing for a return, a renewal, is something that also has been used for all sorts of other purposes. In the early 20th century, we heard calls to, make Italy great again, to revive the Roman Empire, to make Germany great again. And now we hear the call to make America great again. And what is this lost greatness about? Is it just the return of imperial might? I think it actually is, in many ways, calling to something deeper, but in a way that leads people toward a sense toward tribalism, because we feel cut off from ourselves and one another. It's natural for people to want to have a sense of belonging to a tribe. Once again, after all, we live in a world that's cosmopolitan, that's globalized, where we're atomized, commercialized, consumerized. We have a consumer culture in which individualism is prized because it's as individuals that we consume the most. And the more we consume, the more the economy grows. And so we're encouraged to have our own private house and lawnmower and TV set, and we become more and more cut off from the people around us. So the appeal of sometimes charlatans, religious, preachers, to put it nicely, who for self-aggrandizing purposes or for political purposes are calling upon that need, that desire that otherwise isn't being fulfilled, can be very pernicious, because part of that calling may be to regain our own tribal coherency through the exclusion of others, whether they be, gypsies or Jews or Muslims or you name it. So in the end, we want to get back to the garden, but our self-reinforcing pursuit of rational power stops us. After all, our rationality, our language have been sources of immense power. It's through language, the development of language, hundreds of thousands of years ago, most likely, that we gained the power to cooperate in large groups and to cooperate also over time. We were able to coordinate our behavior, whether it was to bring down a mastodon or to put a man on the moon. Language has given us extraordinary power, the ability to categorize and manipulate the world around us, but it's also cut us off. That very power has also provided us with a sense of psychological unease and in that sense, dis-ease. So going back once again to the idea of Max Muller that myth is a disease of language, what value could that phrase possibly have? Well, myth would not exist without language. When we developed language, we developed the ability also to ask questions. Before language, there was no way to make stories. There was no way to ask questions. But with abstract symbols, and I'm not talking about communication per se, because all animals communicate. But language, which is this abstract set of signs and symbols that are meaningless in and of themselves, but we use to, we infer meaning into them. We project meaning onto them and thereby create complex systems of meanings. With language, we can ask, how did we get here? What does that mean? Is that good or bad? And as soon as we start asking those questions, we quickly start coming up with answers. Whether those answers have any factual validity or not, they're answers. And it's easy for those to get passed on. And the ones that are most memorable and most satisfactory to the most people end up getting passed on the most. So this sense of being cut off, it ends up being told as stories of Adam and Eve or world ages or as you like. But it's universal because it's telling us something that we all already know. Are we at the end of a world age? Are we in the Kali Yuga? Is this the worst time to be alive? Well, that's a philosophical question. Clearly, we have followed a certain path of rationality and the development of power over nature as far as it's likely to go in the direction that we've pursued it so far. And I'll be talking more about that tomorrow. And therefore, clearly we are approaching some kind of dramatic turning point. What that is, what that means, what it's likely to look like, I don't think any of us can really know right now. All we can do is look at the global CO2 concentration charts and the global temperature charts and charts of depletion of various resources and species and recognize that this can't go on much longer this way. We're approaching some kind of fundamental turning point. Will it be the end of the world? Will it be a renewal of some kind of paradisal state in the sense of returning to connection with the natural world and our true selves? Well, of course, that's up to us. Maybe it won't be the kind of paradise that any of us have been conditioned to imagine, but an opportunity to come to terms with the reality that's been here all along. We together, or any one of us, can in principle return at any time to our true nature, wild, whole, and free. This, it seems to me, has been the message of every true prophet, whether through acquaintance with our inner child, through meditation, through wordless play with small children or animals, or through a deep encounter with the wilderness, or through art or music or dance. We can choose to activate the part of ourselves that still remembers how to feel, love, and wonder. Yes, we have a lot of work ahead and a lot of minds to change before we can together create sustainable, diverse, decentralized cultures and leave behind oppression, racism, sexism, economic parasitism, and all the other evils of our age. But that process becomes much easier when we share a sense of possibility, an assurance that we don't have to invent paradise so much as return to it, an assurance that at our core we are pure, brilliant, and innocent beings. Our task is not to create ever more elaborate global structures to enforce social and environmental justice, though I sympathize with the motives of people who work toward that end, but rather to strip away the artificiality that separates us from the magical simplicity that is our wild, biotic birthright. The paradise myth continues to transform my vision. Someday, perhaps, human beings will be a blessing to the biosphere of this planet. I can imagine new wild cultures in which people will put more emphasis on laughter and play than on power and possessions, in which our intellects will be engaged in the challenge of increasing the diversity of life rather than merely finding new ways to exploit it. The path from here to there is likely to be a rocky one, but the longer we wait, the less chance we will have of traversing it successfully. Thanks very much.
All of the myths that you referenced, all of them were building toward an end of time. And I just wonder, why is it that we humans are so fixated on everything's going to hell in a handbasket rather than what we could do to change that?
Right. Yeah, we have this funny binary quality to us, and I think that's a part of our rationality. Either we believe that progress is inevitable, and through economic growth and new technologies, life is going to get better and better, or we believe that the world is going to hell. And there doesn't seem to be any middle way. I think that's one of the gifts of studying world religions and mythologies, is to have some sense of historical perspective on the human condition. We've been here for a long time, and we've seen, collectively, we've seen a lot. And it may seem like the best of times, it may seem like the worst of times, but we're just folks, and we're going to get through this.
I wonder if you know that The Wizard of Oz was written by a member of the Theosophical Society.
Oh, yes.
And it actually is a theosophical metaphor. It begins, as you know, in flat, colorless Kansas, which represents the eternal, undifferentiated real, the pre-Big Bang void/plenum. And Dorothy follows her desire into the land of Oz, the sensate world, where it becomes colorful, beautiful, wonderful things, terrifying things, all that. And all while she's there, which of course represents us, she has the power to go back to the eternal, and she doesn't know it. And finally, she clicks her heels.
Right.
And that, I suspect, represents the spiritual path, the foot traveling the spiritual path. So in a
sense, she when she returns to Kansas, she realizes that that's
the real, that's the home.
Right. That's the actual home.
I think a poet once said, when one realizes this inner reality for oneself, it's like coming home and recognizing the place for the first time. And the other quick thing, and I won't go into it too much because it would take too long, the Theosophical philosophy also posits the idea of stages of development. There's an involutionary process, according to the philosophy, where gradually consciousness falls into matter, the Kali Yuga, and from a sense of eternal unity, there's differentiation, and then the arc goes back up to the other. And then there are stages of development of the human being, according to the philosophy, 7 different stages that go on for millennia each one. It starts with the ethereal nature of the human being, who gradually becomes physical and then moves back toward the thing. So that same idea is in the Theosophical philosophy as well.
Could you bring your interpretation to what we find in Genesis, that God gave man dominion over all the beasts and the birds and so on, and we took it literally, and that's the beginning of our downfall? But at the same time, God said, I'm through, I'm resting on the Sabbath. So I just
Yeah.
thought of them while you were speaking. So I don't know whether you were sending me some message.
Yeah, this may be partly a problem of translation. The English word dominion, of course, carries all kinds of meanings that may or may not have been in the original Hebrew. And unfortunately, I'm not enough of a scholar to be able to discourse on that. But there is a tremendous literature on this subject, and what is the name of the creation theology, I believe? Yes. Yeah. Reams have been written on this subject, reinterpreting those first chapters of Genesis to reveal more of a harmony with the attitude of other cultures, which say that human beings, the original human beings, were stewards is another word that's sometimes been used, or having a responsibility to look after and maintain the unity of nature. The sense was that we had a job to do, and it wasn't to lord over creation, but to protect it. In fact.
And the Sabbath, what's your interpretation?
Well, the Sabbath was a time to reflect, and as in many of the cultures, the sense is that ritual practice, including the observation of the Sabbath, all of those are instituted after the loss of the original paradisal condition as ways to remember it or recall it or memorialize it.
It just feels to me like the chaos theory describes the myth or vice versa, that you have the order and then what seems like the destruction is really just a reorganization period for a new order in a spiraling up, according to Theosophical theory. So what do you feel about that?
Yeah. Well, even in ecological studies, there's the theory of resilience, whereas where in an ecosystem there's a natural sequence of stages. No ecosystem stays the same all the time. You go through natural disturbance, through entry of new species from outside. Disturbance happens, then there's a sequence of stages of recovery. And when an ecosystem is at its most robust, it's actually most vulnerable to collapse. But that sets the stage again for a new cycle. So cycles are inherent in all of reality, as far as we can tell. And this sense that we have today, I think that we are living in a society that, because it is so powerful, because our economists and technologists are so smart, that it will somehow continue to evolve in a unidirectional pathway toward larger and larger economy, bigger and bigger population, and so on. On a philosophical level, never mind the simple practical level, that doesn't make sense.